Welcome to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. Today we're going to talk about the repeal of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's 2009 endangerment finding. This all started in 2007 when the United States Supreme Court ruled that greenhouse gases are air pollutants and that they can be regulated under the Clean Air Act. This landmark decision affirmed the EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions and led to the 2009 endangerment finding. The summary of this finding reads, the administration finds that 6 greenhouse gases taken in combination endanger both the public health and the public welfare of current and future generations. The administration also finds that the combined emissions of these greenhouse gases from new motor vehicles and new motor vehicle engines contribute to the greenhouse gas pollution that endangers public health and welfare under the Clean Air Act, Section 202A. The summary goes on to say that these findings are based on careful consideration of the full weight of scientific evidence and a thorough review of numerous public comments. Now, the full weight of scientific evidence. The finding was accompanied by a 200-page technical support document composed of peer-reviewed science drawn from the assessment reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the U.S. Climate Change Science Program, the U.S. Global Change Research Program, and the National Research Council. That's a lot of heavy, substantiated scientific evidence. This finding is why we adopted the U.S. Clean Energy Power Plan. It's why we became a party to the Paris Climate Agreement. In short, the EPA's 2009 endangerment finding is the foundation of the U.S. government's legal authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions and to combat climate change. Of course, not everybody likes regulations, even if it does prevent the endangerment of the public. Columbia University reports that the second Trump administration has implemented significant rollbacks of environmental regulations, including over 200 climate-related laws. For instance, in April of 2025, the Trump administration dismissed the entire staff of over 400 scientists working on the congressionally mandated National Climate Assessment Report. This report contains the latest assessment of the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions on things like U.S. agriculture, energy, land and water resources, human health, social systems, biodiversity, and more. This report actually forms the basis for much of the United States corporate and government climate policy. In June of 2025, the Trump administration took down the government website that provided access to the past National Climate Assessment reports. So all of that data vanished. In July of 25, Trump's Department of Energy released a report written by a newly formed climate working group composed of 5 scientists known for their opposition to mainstream climate science. Opposition. And on that very same day, Trump's EPA cited this climate working group report in their announcement that they were rescinding the 2009 endangerment finding. One might be excused for thinking that this timeline was based more on political motivation than on scientific review. In September of 25, an international group of 85 scientists led by climate scientist Andrew Dessler and Robert Kopp wrote a 434-page rebuttal, concluding that the CWG report contained numerous instances, cherry-picking data, overemphasis of uncertainties, misquoting peer-reviewed research, and a general dismissal of the vast majority of decades of peer-reviewed research. And on February 12 of 2026, the EPA finalized its rescission of the 2009 endangerment finding and the repeal of all subsequent greenhouse gas emission standards for vehicles and engines. As a result of these changes, auto manufacturers no longer have any obligation to measure, control, or report on greenhouse emissions from any of their cars or trucks, including model years prior to this rule. We're joined today on Zoom by Dr. Dessler. Dr. Dessler is a climate scientist in the Department of Atmospheric Sciences at Texas A&M University and the director of Texas A&M's Texas Center for Climate Studies. He studies physics of climate systems as well as how those changes impact humans. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Physics from Rice University and a PhD in Chemistry from Harvard University. Andrew has been a senior policy analyst in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and has testified before the U.S. Senate Committee of Environment and Public Works. He has served as a member of NASA's Earth Science Advisory Committee and on NASA's Senior Review of Operating Missions. He's authored 2 books on climate change, The Science and Politics of Global Climate Change and Introduction to Modern Climate Change, which won the American Meteorological Society's Louis J. Batten Authors Award. Andrew is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and of the American Geophysical Union. He's a Google Science Communication Fellow And in 2021, he won the American Geophysical Union's Climate Communication Award. He's currently the president of AGU's Global Environmental Change section. Hi, Andrew.
Howdy.
So let's just get right into it. Trump's Climate Working Group. Who are they and what's wrong with their report?
The authors of the report are people who are among the very, very, very few scientists in the area who dispute the mainstream scientific case that carbon dioxide is mainly what's causing the warming, and that we're on track for geologically enormous amount of warming this century. And the risks of that are very high. There are very few scientists who dispute any of those. You really have to go out and find them. And the Secretary of Energy did that. He went out and he found people to give him the message that he wanted to get.
So cherry picking the data and apparently cherry picking the report authors.
Exactly. There's almost no other way you could have gotten the report that was written. The only way to get that report was to find these scientists.
What was the CWG report? Was there any sort of peer review? What did that peer review period look like?
So it went through an internal DOE review, and it was extremely flawed what they did. So to be clear, there was no peer. This was not peer review in any way that science understands it. The internal DOE review was they sent the comments to, I think it was 8 DOE employees. We don't know who they are. We don't know how knowledgeable they are. Reading the comments, which have all been released, the comments actually weren't terrible. They were better than I thought they would be. And then they send them back to the authors, and the authors basically ignored, I think, the tough comments that they got. And it's important to understand that that's not how peer review is supposed to work. Let me just, it's important for people to understand how peer review works. If I submit a paper to a journal, it goes out to peer reviewers, and then it comes back, and then it comes to me, and I have to make the changes, and then I have to send it back to the editor of the journal. And the editor of the journal checks to see if I made appropriate corrections in response to the criticisms. And then it might even go back out to the reviewers, and they get to see what my responses are. In this case, they send it back to the authors. There was nobody checking to see if they actually did legitimate corrections. And, so that's not how peer review works. If you send it just back to the authors, any author of scientific paper is going to read this and think these reviewers are idiots. I'm not going to make these changes. My paper was perfect when I sent it in. You think of your papers very much like you think of your children. And so you have to have an editor there, and the authors know the editor is going to look over their comments and is going to look at how they responded. So in normal peer review, you have to respond in a serious way. They did not respond in a serious way. So there was in fact, they specifically, if you read their emails, they specifically say we cannot call this peer review. We have to call it an internal DOE review.
So they even acknowledged that this was not peer reviewed.
This was not peer reviewed.
So the authors, the 5 authors who wrote this, I keep reading about this process, and they're constantly being referred to as having contrary views. What does that mean, contrary? I mean, in scientific terms, how do I interpret the fact that they're contrary views?
So in science, there's some body of knowledge for any field, whether it's biology or physics or atmospheric science, and there are things that we think we know. Now some of them are known much more certainly than other things. So we know, for example, the Earth is warming. So that's beyond doubt. There's no question about that. And so really nobody anymore disputes that. In addition, we know that humans are responsible for most of the warming. And there's really not a lot of debate about that either. And then there are things that we know with, I would say, lower confidence. For example, how much warming we're going to get in the future. And we don't really know that because we don't know the human side. We don't know how much people are going to predict. We don't know how much people are going to emit our society, because that's determined by government policies, and that's determined by elections that haven't happened yet. So you really can't predict those very, very confidently. You can predict a range of emission scenarios. It'll probably fall somewhere in this range. Now, when we talk about people that have contrary views, those are people that dispute things that we actually know quite well. So, as an example, one of the things that they disputed in this Climate Working Group report is that there's no trend in extreme weather. And they infer from that climate change is not making extreme, in particular, extreme heat, I should say, not just extreme weather, extreme heat. And they therefore conclude that climate change isn't making extreme heat worse. And that's just ridiculous. I mean, we have many analyses that show that climate change is indeed making extreme heat events worse. I find it amazing anybody would argue that that's not the case. And so that's what we mean by contrary views. These views that just defy all of the work we know. It's kind of like someone who says the Earth is flat. I mean, it's not far from that. You might say, oh, that's exaggeration. Slightly, it's a slight exaggeration. It is not a big exaggeration to go from their arguments over no trend in extreme weather, especially extreme heat, and the Earth is flat. I view those as basically equivalent statements.
So contrary to the massive public opinion.
And not public opinion, contrary to the massive peer-reviewed science.
Peer-reviewed science, yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
that's really
absolutely.
the peer-reviewed literature contains what science knows and contains how confidently we know it. Mm-hmm. And so if you want to say, what do scientists think of something, read the literature. And if there are 100 papers on it and 98 of them say this and 2 of them say this, you can probably go with the 98 as being what the scientists think. And there's some exceptions to that, but that's a general rule. And if you go against that, if you go with the 2 papers instead of the 98 papers, that's contrary.
I understand, yes. The report's lead author, John Christie. Now, he's a climate scientist at the University of Alabama. He holds a BA in mathematics, a master in divinity degree from Golden Gate Baptist Seminary, and a PhD in atmospheric sciences from the University of Illinois. He's actually appointed Alabama's state climatologist, and he's been awarded NASA's Medal for Exceptional Scientific Achievement for his development of a global temperature data set from satellites. Now, his data set, the satellite data set, originally showed a net global cooling trend, which is opposition to, the ground and the balloon measurements we generally see. So the satellite's shown that net cooling trend. But Dr. Christie and his colleagues have since identified several factors, including orbital drift, decay, that kind of stuff, that actually caused the net cooling bias of his satellite data. And since correcting for these errors, even his satellite data is showing an average global warming 0.14 degrees Celsius per day. How much did this satellite data play into the CW report? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, no, I'm very familiar with it. And I would just make one correction to what you say. It wasn't Dr. Christie who identified the errors. He and his colleague, Dr. Spencer, they never find the mistakes. Other people find the mistakes and point them out. And then they say, oh, yeah, that was wrong. And then they make a bunch of changes and the trend goes up a little. And in the past, as they make a bunch of changes, they introduce other errors, and all of their errors always are in the same direction, to lower the trend. And you can make of that what you will. I know what I make of that. But to answer the question that you specifically asked, which is how does this play into it? It's a very minor part of the CWG report, Climate Working Group report. They do talk about it, but I would say by no means is that a big part of their argument.
Okay, so his background in satellite data, that really doesn't play in the current report and such. So let's talk about your report, which is titled Climate Experts Review of the DOE Climate Working Group Report. I believe you posted a question on social media asking if anybody was coordinating a response to the DOE report. What happened after that?
Yeah, let me say first, I think DOA Climate Report is actually the better way to describe the DOE Climate Report. I may steal that.
Okay, go right ahead.
Yeah, so when I saw it, so July 29th, 2025, I start seeing on social media, DOE releases this thing. And, before I even downloaded it, I could have guessed 5 authors and they were all there. I mean, again, as I said before, there's not very many people who would write this report. And to get this report, you had to get these people and these people only. So it was not a surprise at all, the author list. And so I downloaded the report and I looked at it and, I was offended. I respect science. I love science. I've devoted my life to science. And this report was a mockery of science. It violated every scientific norm of science. things you don't do, and things that everyone has to make their own decision, but are right up to the line, if not over the line, of scientific misconduct. I think this was a bad report, and I thought, it's one thing if this came out of the Heritage Foundation or the Heartland Institute or the Cato Institute. Those people put out misinformation all the time. Nobody really listens to them. But it came out of the Department of Energy. This is the US government. And it was also clear that they were using this, or they wanted to use it, to overturn the endangerment finding, which, as you described, is this key linchpin of US climate policy. And so I thought, I've got to do something. I can't just let this go unanswered. And so I said on social media, this is the perfect thing for a sort of a coordinated response, because it's such a broad area, has agricultural impacts and sea level rise and economics. No one person could write a response to this. So I said, there should be a community response to this. And what I didn't realize is that if you send out a message like that, you're basically saying, I volunteer, because, people started, responding like, I don't think anybody's doing it. You should do it. And I'm sort of at the stage in my career, I'm senior enough that I thought, if I'm not going to do it, who's going to do it? And to be clear, I didn't want to do it. This is a thankless job. And, how many planetary physicists want to get up on a stage and argue with people about whether the Earth is round or not? I would say not very many. And so that's basically what this argument was. I mean, again, people may think it's an exaggeration to compare them to flat earthers, but it's not much of an exaggeration, maybe a smidge of an exaggeration. They're much closer to flat earthers than they are to mainstream scientists or people acting as scientists at all. And so after I decided to do it, I said, okay, we need to have an organized approach. And so I put out a Google form that I circulated on social media. And I just said, if you want to write a section, fill out this form. I got a mailing list within a day or two. And then I created a spreadsheet, Google Sheets sheet. I sent an email out saying, sign up for a section. I wasn't going to tell anybody to do anything to sign up. And it turns out that we had people sign up for every section. So it's like, oh, that's good. And then I started getting emails from people who aren't on social media saying, hey, I heard you're doing a response. I want in. And the thing I think that I learned from this is that I wasn't the only one who was mad about the mockery of science that this report represented. As scientists, we take science extremely seriously. And that's why scientists always look so mad when they're confronted with nonsense, because, we understand the care that goes into this. We understand the multiple layers of review. We spend an enormous amount of time trying not to be wrong. And these people basically just wrote essentially something that was a mockery of science, and people were mad. And so, these people who are very busy people, very high level people, they were willing to spend their time doing it. So the time frame to write a response was incredibly short. We had 30 days. And so I gave everybody a deadline of 2 weeks. And, I had no idea what was going to come out of it. But at the end of those 2 weeks, the responses came in. It's like, by God, we did it.
Were you surprised by the enormity of the response? I mean, we're talking about over 85 scientists around the world.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was surprised, but again, what I learned is how mad the community was because of how seriously we take science and how unseriously the authors of this report take science. The report is basically propaganda for fossil fuels. It's not science. And people were mad that this was being portrayed as science. And I think that people were willing to spend time to make sure that everybody understood that was not the case.
The summary for your report, the summary for policymakers, reads in part, the basic science of Earth's climate has been well established through 2 centuries of research. Over the 16 years since the Environmental Protection Agency's 2009 endangerment finding, the evidence for human-caused climate change and the dangers it poses to public health and welfare has continued to grow stronger. The report, authored by the 5 members of the Department of Energy Climate Working Group, fails to adequately represent this reality. Your summary goes on to say that the CWG report exhibits pervasive problems with misrepresentation, selective citation of scientific literature, cherry picking of data, and faulty or absent statistics. How does your report, how does the rebuttal, how did it go about forming a reaction to that report? I mean, did you directly compare your science to their comments? How did your report work?
Well, given the very short length of time we had to write it, I mean, it's basically 2 weeks. people had 2 weeks to write it. So what happened was every section, every person who signed up for a section, that section got together, 6.3.3, they got together and they started talking like, what's our response? And then one person drafted something and other people were editing it. And so it was done on a section by section basis. And what I would say it's similar to is it's very similar to peer review. So as scientists, all of us review lots of papers. I get many papers a year to review. I read them. I evaluate their arguments. I say, this is weak. Yeah, this is a good argument. Oh, why don't you try this? I wish you talked more about this. I think you're going the wrong direction here. And, we have a lot of experience doing that. And that's essentially what we did, except in this case, it was, you're ignoring 100 papers. You cite one paper, but you're ignoring 100 papers that say the other thing. You're ignoring all of our physical arguments about something, just looking at observations. I mean, it was all about how they were cherry picking data, how they were misrepresenting what the science said, how they were citing older work when newer work contradicts it. And we were just pointing out all of what I call the scientific felonies of the report, the places where they violate the norms of science. So, that was left up to each group. And if you read our response, which is available online, you can see it's not, it's uneven. Some sections are much better than others. There are some sections which I think you could publish. I mean, they are incredibly well put together. Other sections, maybe not quite as well put together. That's what you get in a situation like this. If they had given us 3 months to reply, we could have had 500 scientists writing 2,000 pages. I mean, it's almost limitless how many pages we could write because there are so many errors in this report. Every time I open it, I see another mistake. Our rebuttal was approximately 3 times as long. And that's this is an example of what they call Brandolini's law online, which is that the amount of energy and effort it takes to refute BS is orders of magnitude more than it takes to say the BS. You can say in one line, oh, extreme heat's not getting worse. That's one line. And what do I have to do to refute that? Well, I have to write 3 pages, show some data. It is enormously bigger lift to refute a report that's kind of cleverly written, but is still misleading. It takes a lot of work to do that, much more than it takes to write the report in the first place.
Now, you've submitted the report to the Department of Energy and the head of the EPA. Have you gotten any response?
Yeah, last time I checked, which admittedly wasn't that recently, they hadn't even posted our comment online. Here's what I think happened. Very quickly after the deadline for comments passed, which was September 2nd, the DOE looked at this and said, we're never going to be able to respond to these comments. And that means that they can't use it. They can't use it in the endangerment finding response because that has to go through a court of law. And while you can get away with a lot of BS in public, in op-eds and venues where rules of evidence don't apply, that doesn't work in a court of law. And they would be able to point out all of the comments that hadn't been responded to. And so I think they very quickly realized this report was dead. And in fact, when you read the final rule that the EPA put out to rescind the endangered finding, they specifically say we're not relying on this because of problems identified after the report was submitted. And so I think they've just basically stopped. I mean, my guess is they've just stopped working on it. Although they say, the authors of the CWG report say that they're going to continue to work on it. I don't think we'll ever see anything.
You're listening to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. We're speaking with Dr. Andrew Dessler about the EPA's repeal of its 2009 endangerment finding. So we're talking about how this CWG report really didn't look at science. And let's go over the mainstream science. I mean, again, for our listeners, where are we at on things? I mean, what's the ongoing cost of using fossil fuels according to mainstream science?
Yeah, so let's talk about the things that we know with very high confidence. We know the Earth is warming. That's really beyond doubt. In fact, and I don't think anybody really argues that anymore. We know humans are the dominant driver of this warming. Again, I don't think people really dispute that at this point. We don't really know what's going to happen in the future because we don't know how much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases we're going to emit. But sort of a middle of the road scenario puts us at about 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial. We're already that's 3 degrees. 3 degrees Celsius, which is about 5 or 6 degrees Fahrenheit. We're already warmed the climate about 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's about 2.8 Fahrenheit. So we have, 1 or 1.5 degrees of warming coming in the future, sort of give or take. It might be more than that, it might be less than that. We really just don't know what's going to happen. And so those are things that we know with really very high confidence. We also know that many, not all, many types of extreme weather are increasing in frequency, increasing in severity, or increasing in their damage. So heat wave. We know heat waves are getting worse. Intense precipitation events. We know intense precipitation is getting more intense. There's not a lot of dispute about those things. We know that sea level rise is occurring because of humans. That means that every hurricane that happens, its storm surge is riding on a higher sea level. And that makes the total flood depth higher. Because if sea level goes up a foot and you have a 10-foot storm surge, that's 11 feet of water. And we also know there are lots of things about hurricanes. We know hurricanes are rainier. We know that rainfall or precipitation is more variable. So when it rains harder, and then you have a longer period with no rain. That makes wildfires worse. So there are all of these impacts that we are very confident are happening due to climate change. Now, climate change is never the only thing happening, okay? So climate change doesn't cause a heat wave. It makes a heat wave worse. It doesn't cause a rain event. It makes the rain event worse. I like to analogize climate change as like steroids. Yeah, steroids don't hit a home run. Steroids don't go to the batter's box and swing a bat. But if you give it to a baseball player, he hits more home runs. So carbon dioxide doesn't cause these events, but you add it to the atmosphere, these events get worse. Now, the question you asked about the cost, this is a much harder problem. And there are a lot of economists who have worked on what's the cost of the impacts of climate change. And you get a very wide range of answers. Some economists actually think the climate change will have a quite low value impact, what we call the social cost of carbon. Other economists think it'll be extremely high, extremely costly. I can just tell you that I did a paper last year where I looked at the cost of climate change on electricity consumption and how much that cost the average Texas resident, and it's about $80 a person. And so, for a lot of people, that's not a big deal. But for people at the bottom of society, that's a huge extra cost. And that's just going to go up. And then you multiply that by the millions of places that climate change is affecting our world. And you can quickly convince yourself that we're paying a lot of money. And that's just the climate impacts. You should take me to jail if I don't talk about the other impacts of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels generate enormous amounts of air pollution that kills millions of people every year. And for something that's of extreme relevance to the US right now, fossil fuels impact our national security. Why are we having a war in Iran right now? What is it that's underlying the invasion of Ukraine? Why did we invade Iraq in 2003? Why did we invade Kuwait in 1992? Whatever year that was. A lot of those things, if not directly for fossil fuels are the underlying enabling factor. And the cost of those are immense. The Department of Defense is going to ask the White House to ask Congress for $200 billion for this war in Iran. And that's $600 a person. You and me, $600. Let's write a check. And who knows when they're going to come back and ask for more money. If you ask about the Iraq invasion in 2003, that was about $3 trillion, more like $10,000 a U.S. resident. And the Defense Department spends about $100 billion, actually a little bit less than $100 billion every year on defense spending just to defend the oil supply line. So we pay an incredibly high price for fossil fuels. So it's not just the climate impacts, which are severe. It's all of these other things also. I mean, fossil fuels, we should tip our hat to them. They've been great. They got us where we are today. We live lives of unimaginable luxury to anybody who lived before fossil fuels. But this is not a debate about the past, it's a debate about the future. Fossil fuels are not the fuel of the future. And we need to understand they're not the fuel of the future. The only reason that we still are arguing about it is because of the political power of the fossil fuel industry. They're probably the most powerful special interest in the history of humanity. Anyway, I've ranted too long there. I'll let you get back into this.
No, it's a good rant, and you're moving in that direction. I mean, fossil fuels are behind a lot of our geopolitical instability, our emissions, all of that. We understand that. And the alternative obviously is renewable energy, among other things. What's the state of renewable energy today?
Well, renewable energy is the cheapest energy we have today. In fact, I've seen people say that solar is currently the cheapest energy in the history of the world. And, right now, if you just look at price at the pump or price at the wall socket, the cheapest fossil fuel power and renewables are roughly comparable. But again, you have to add in all of these, what economists call externalities. It's external costs, the cost of climate change, the cost of the fact you have to run your air conditioner more, the fact that people die of air pollution, the fact that we have to pay the Department of Defense so they have the weaponry to attack Iran. If you include those things, fossil fuels would be incredibly expensive. And so, the fossil fuel interests are extremely desperate to keep us from connecting the dots.
So I hear you say renewables now kind of equivalent, same cost as fossil fuels. And I
Yeah.
would expect as we build up more infrastructure, I mean, obviously the cost right now is creation of the renewable infrastructure. As that infrastructure becomes more established, the price of renewables should come down while the price of extraction of fossil fuels is going up.
Right. So in fact, you can see that's the case. If you look at, ERCOT, or Energy Reliability Council of Texas, they run the Texas grid. They publish statistics, what they call the interconnection queue, which is what kinds of power people are planning to hook up to the grid. And if you look at it, it's 80% solar and battery, and about 10% wind, and about 10% natural gas. And so, the energy developers, these are not Birkenstock wearing hippies. These are Texas energy developers who want to make money. They understand the cheapest power is solar, and they understand that if they can hook solar up to the grid, they're going to make a lot of money. Natural gas is not a great way to make money, at least not without government support. And so, so definitely the market has already shifted towards renewables. And so what the special interests, the fossil fuel special interests are doing is they're going to the government and telling the government to put their thumbs on their scale to try to prevent the build out of renewables. So you see all sorts of executive orders. That was the word I was looking for. Executive orders coming from the Trump administration, trying to harm wind, especially offshore wind, which Trump apparently especially hates, but also solar. So this is not Republican free market orthodoxy, because the free market would wipe out fossil fuels. They're trying to do whatever they can to keep the incumbents in there making money.
So the Trump administration is trying hard to lock us into fossil fuels while they're rolling back renewable options.
And that's exactly right. They want to lock us into fossil fuels, because if you build a lot of fossil fuel infrastructure, it's going to be really hard to stop using it.
Keep hearing references to the tobacco playbook. Talk a little bit about that and explain to our listeners how that's working into this debate.
Sure. So if you go back to the early 60s, in particular 1964, the U.S. Surgeon General Luther Terry put out a report saying that cigarettes are bad. Cigarettes are bad for you. And even at the time, most people said, yeah, we kind of understand that cigarettes are not good for your health. And the response to that from the tobacco company was not, okay, you guys got us. We'll stop making and selling tobacco. No, they did not say that. What they said was, we need to think of a reason to give people so that they can continue smoking. We need to play up the uncertainty in the science. We need to make other arguments that sort of give people I think the word they used was psychological crutch to continue to justify to themselves smoking. And that's what they did. They ran what we now refer to as the tobacco playbook, where, they found scientists who are willing to go on the record and say that the science connecting smoking and health impacts was not solid. If that sounds familiar, it should, because that's exactly what's happening now. Chris Wright, the Secretary of Energy, finds scientists. He knows what they're going to say in advance. There was never any question what they were going to say. And, they did exactly what he wanted them to do. He never told them to do that. He didn't have to. He knew what they were going to say, and they said it.
So you're saying the CWG report is just a page out of the tobacco playbook?
Absolutely. They're trying to create doubt. In fact, a lot of emails between members of CWG were released from Freedom of Information Act requests, or a lawsuit over that. And there's actually even an email in there where one of the CWG members says, my hope is that we can create reasonable scientific doubt. And it's a real echo to a 1960s memo from someone at Brown and Williamson Tobacco who said doubt is our product. So they understood what they were trying to do. They're trying to introduce doubt. They're not trying to win the debate. The tobacco companies were never trying to prove smoking was safe. The CWG is never trying to prove that climate change doesn't exist or CO2 is not causing it. They're just trying to create doubt. They're trying to create doubt to give the policymakers cover so they don't have to regulate carbon dioxide.
Your personal body of work seems to be shifting more towards the intersection of climate change and human society. Can you talk more about that?
So I spent most of my career working on climate physics. So global climate physics, things like water vapor and clouds and how climate change will change those. And then in the late 2010s and sort of early 2020s, I kind of decided that the big questions were really no longer in those areas. And then we had the big Texas blackout and, where we lost power for a few days during a big winter storm. And I remember walking out on the back patio one evening and it was incredibly dark because there were no lights on anywhere. And I just kind of thought, we're not prepared for this. And let me be clear, I don't think climate change caused or even enhanced the winter storm that caused a blackout. In fact, I think if anything, climate change made it less cold than it would have been. But the point is, that winter storm took us a bit outside the range that we were adapted to. Not a lot, maybe 5 or 10 degrees, but just 5 or 10 degrees outside the range that we normally get was enough to crash the whole grid. It was an incredibly expensive $100 billion disaster. Hundreds, if not 1,000 people died. It was a really terrible event. And just a few degrees outside of our normal range. And so if you look at the future, I'm not worried about cold events, but we're going to be that range on the hot side. And so I started thinking that that's where the big questions lie. The big questions lie on how society is going to deal as the temperature gets a few degrees outside the range that we expect. And so I started working on that intersection between the physical climate system and the social system.
And the social system includes what? People's health?
Everything that you would sort of classify as human systems. So, the power grid is a human system that I have work on. People's health, that's another sort of thing that we care about. Real estate. I have a student who's working on the impact of disasters on real estate. So, it's all of these things are the things that I think we don't really understand. And it's going to be the place where climate change really affects us. As I described earlier, if your electricity bills go up, most people can pay an extra $80, but not everybody can. And if you can't pay an extra $80 a year for electricity, then you have to make a choice. Do I pay rent? Do I buy food? Do I pay for electricity? And I think this is really the challenge and the challenge of climate change, and that's where I want to be working.
Yeah, it's a good place to go. You mentioned the grid collapse, that big grid collapse in Texas. I remember reading after the collapse that a lot of people were blaming the renewable power plants for that. What's your response on that?
Yeah, well, it's the power of fossil fuel special interests. People who are beholden to fossil fuels, they can't ever say anything bad about fossil fuels. So they look to blame anything else. But that's ridiculous. We understand what happened. The cold temperatures shut off the production of natural gas. So the natural gas fields essentially froze. And once the natural gas production stopped, then the natural gas plants stopped. And it turns out, in sort of irony, perhaps, a lot of the natural gas production facilities, like compression stations and pumping gates and things like that, those run on electricity. When the electricity grid went down, those stopped. So that actually further cut off the flow of natural gas. And so we lost, 30 gigawatts of natural gas power, which is a lot of power to lose when your demand is probably 80 gigawatts. And it was the case, to be completely fair, that renewables, especially wind, didn't produce very much power. But with renewables, you expect them not to produce a lot of power, and you expect the fossil fuel plants to counterbalance the intermittency. So when the intermittency is not balanced it's the fossil fuel plant's fault. It's not the renewables' fault. We know that renewables don't produce all the time.
In the year 2000, you were a senior analyst at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. How did that experience inform your current view of science and politics?
Well, so I learned there sort of how science is consumed at that level of the government. And I learned things like everybody understands a line plot. Like if you show them a plot and the line is going up, it's like everybody kind of understands that. You show them like a really complicated plot of longitude on this axis and time on this axis, what we call a Hofmüller diagram. Nobody understands that. And I also understand that, people don't really care for science's sake at that level. They really want to say, what's the impact of this? And for a long time, I didn't really, I still worked on the physics, but that's one of the things that sort of motivated my switch to look at the human impact side of climate change. This idea that that's really what people care about. I don't think anybody cares about the global temperature for the temperature's sake. They care about it for how it impacts us.
So getting back to the CWT report, now that they've repealed, they've actually repealed the 2009 endangerment finding and all the greenhouse gas emission controls that go with that. So now that we have no control on auto emissions, what do you think that's going to do to the public health and environment?
That's a good question. I think a lot of it depends on whether industries kind of go along with the regulations. And let me explain what I mean by that. So let's take the auto industry. So the repeal of the endangerment finding specifically affected auto emissions. And so right now, there are no limits on what cars can emit. On the other hand, if you look around the world, it's very clear that electric vehicles are the wave of the future. You go to China, half the cars sold there are electric, and the electric car companies in China are basically taking over the world. The only places where they're not taking over are places where they're not allowed to import, like the US. And so I think the US car companies are really facing a choice. They can say, we're going to continue to build gasoline cars with no emissions reductions, but we're not going to be able to sell them anywhere other than the US. And really only because we're not allowed to import cheaper electric cars from China right now. If Ford and GM and those companies want to be global automakers, they've got to go electric. They have to. There's no debate about that. And so I think that the impact of this, my hope is that it's too late. That solar energy is so cheap. Electric cars are the future, that people understand that this is going to happen. And we're not going to need government policies to encourage it, as long as we don't get government policies to prevent it. So the next step might be the government passing a law preventing car companies from building EVs. It would be shocking, but so many things that I thought, oh, that will never happen, have actually happened, that I never rule anything out at this point. So, so the optimistic side of me says that the energy transition is far enough along that repealing these things won't have a huge impact. Maybe it'll slow down a little, but hopefully not too much. But the pessimistic side of me says, maybe if it delays it even 5 years, that's going to be very bad news for the climate. So I don't really know. We'll see what happens. A lot of it depends on election. And this is why it's so hard to predict the future of emissions, that the next election will have a big determinant on the future of U.S. policy. We'll see who wins.
Yes, it will have a big impact. The endangerment finding, overturning that, obviously it's affecting emissions on vehicles now. Do you think that they'll take that further and look at removing emission controls on, say, power plants and manufacturing and other areas?
I don't know for a fact, but I would be shocked if that wasn't their plan.
So your work in the White House, your political studies, is that what led to your book? What was your recent book, The Science and Politics of Global Climate Change, A Guide to the Debate? Talk about your book.
Yeah, so that's an interesting story. So when I was at the White House, I really got schooled in how science gets consumed at that level. And then I went back, I was at the University of Maryland at the time, and I was teaching a class that was just sort of a general ed class on various earth and environmental sciences. And what I realized while I was teaching that is the students really liked to hear about the politics of it. You could talk about sigma t to the fourth and energy balance, and they don't care about that. And their eyes kind of glaze over. But you start talking about politics, all of a sudden they kind of perk up. They're much more interested in that. So I thought, oh, this is really interesting. I should write a book on this because I thought I had kind of an interesting angle. And I was talking to someone else who worked at the White House when I was there, Ted Parson, and we decided to write the book together. And I think that was really a smart move because I'm a physical scientist and he's a social scientist. And so together we really cover the whole science to policy part of it. And, we really focus the book on this intersection of science and policy, how science gets used in policy and how people use and misuse science in the policy debate. So yeah, the book's now in its third edition, so it's been reasonably successful. Although, the problem with writing any book on climate change is it's immediately out of date the day it comes out because things are moving so fast. That book, the third edition, came out in 2019, and I haven't, I wouldn't even want to. It is out of date. Many aspects of it are out of date.
Yeah, things move fast. I know your book discusses policy options, the current state of policy debate, and it provides guidance to practical routes forward. What are those? What are the practical routes forward?
Well, so what we talked about in the book, and actually I think it probably is still relevant, is that sort of these global negotiations don't seem to work that well. So if you try to come up with a global climate agreement that all countries will agree to, it's very hard to find them because there are some countries that really want fast action, deep cuts. There are some countries that don't. And so how do you just split the difference? Or so an alternative, which is what we advocated, was this idea of a coalition of the willing. Kind of goes back to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, where George W. Bush went around the world and found all the countries that were willing to support the U.S. invading Iraq. And that may not have turned out great, but in the climate sphere, you could do something similar, which might turn out great, which is find all the countries that want to participate and create a coalition. So, the countries, obviously the EU, they're very bullish on climate policy. Maybe you could get China on board. There are a lot of countries which you think, okay, they would probably be on board. Before, 10 years ago, you'd say, the US could join. Maybe the U.S. wouldn't join now, but those coalitions of the willing, they would create essentially a trading bloc, and they would start implementing climate policy. They would trade within themselves, and if you wanted to trade with them and you weren't cutting your carbon emissions, there'd be a carbon tax imposed at the border. So a country that wasn't reducing their emissions, if they were going to export a high carbon good or service, when you imported it, you would have to pay a carbon tax at that point. And so that would be this incentive for other countries to join because they would want to get inside that trading bloc, trading organization. So that's one way to do it. I by no means think that's the only way, but certainly that has the advantage that you don't have to come up with a global agreement that everybody can agree to, because it's quite clear there's some countries that really don't want to see anything done on climate change.
So since your book has come out, you said 2019, the second Trump administration now, deregulating so much of that. Do you feel like they've changed the debate? Is the route forward different under the current administration?
I think if anything, they've made that procedure or that approach better, more likely to succeed, because if the U.S. doesn't want to do anything about climate, you're never going to get a global climate agreement. So I think a coalition of the willing is really the way to go on that. And the other thing I would say is, just from an economic standpoint, the U.S. is really committing economic suicide with our policies on energy. You look at China, and they understand the future of energy as renewables, and they're really building out their production of solar panels and wind turbines. They're exporting that stuff, so they make money on exports. Also, as they build that out and they switch to electric cars, they're importing less oil. And so China really understands this, and they're going to own energy in the 21st century in much the same way the US and Saudi Arabia and other big oil producers own the energy of the 20th century. China's going to own the energy of the 21st century. And, it's going to be hard to compete with them when they've got cheaper energy than we do.
Well, thank you for joining us today. Where can our listeners go to learn more about your work?
So I have a Substack, The Climate Brink, one word. So theclimatebrink.com. So go there. I write there. I have a great co-author, Zeke Housefather, and we write, once a week. It's free. We don't charge for subscriptions. So otherwise, follow me on Blue Sky.
Very good. Thank you. And thank you to our listeners. We welcome your questions and feedback. You can learn more about the Climate Hour at climatehour.net. That's climatehour.net. This is the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove.